My name is Amy Knowles. I am the City of Miami Beach's Chief Resilience Officer and the Director for the Department of Environment and Sustainability. Just welcome to Miami Beach. It's my pleasure to introduce this panel and just tell you a little bit, just 2 minutes, about Miami Beach's approach to resilient coastlines. We couldn't miss this opportunity. So again, we are thrilled to have you here. We are a coastal barrier island, if you haven't noticed. We're about 7 square miles, a very small island, and we protect the mainland. And as part of that, we are extremely vulnerable to flooding ourselves. Our average elevation is about 4.5 feet, and we reach a balmy 18 feet at the very highest point of our dune system in South Point Park. So flooding is very important to us. Resilience is very important to us. And it's something that we work on every day. And on the west side of our island, it's the lowest. We have elevations as low as 1.5 feet, 1.2 feet, extremely low, and that are experiencing flooding issues now. So as we invest as in our city, we're making sure to invest wisely and incorporate everything that we can do to positively impact our environment, creating marine habitat, and really doing it in such a way that also cools our island. We are 55 miles of seawalls, but only 5 of them are owned by the city. And what that means is that we have to do a very careful job in the work that we do to really just make sure that we're incorporating as much resilience as we can. And I wanted to share a couple of stories with you. If you haven't been there yet, immediately north of the Miami Beach Convention Center that we're in is a floodable linear park that just a few years ago was actually an area for loading trucks to be just parking and dropping off goods. There is a canal that runs north of the building, and it basically is very old. The seawall was very low. And so instead of just rebuilding that seawall in a concrete way, the city added mangroves, created a mangrove habitat, added pathways that can be walked through. It connects the botanical gardens with Washington Ave and the Collins Historic District. And it is a beautiful park that really was created from nothing. So I encourage you to take a look if you haven't. It's very close by. Another area is Brittany Bay Park, which just recently opened. And because we don't have a lot of space, we can't build out into our waterways, we have to build in. So this is an example where we built the seawall into the park, which then turned into a seating bench. I believe it is just opening this week. We have our capital improvements director here. Is it open? Almost? Yes, okay. But we've added about 680 mangroves. We've added a lookout so that people can fish and still see and enjoy the water. One of my staff, Juanita's here and helped plant those mangroves. And so this is a real pride and joy for us. And we had to really think very creatively on how to build that in. So with that, I hope you have an opportunity to visit either the dune system or this special park right near Miami Beach Convention Center or Brittany Bay Park and just enjoy Miami Beach. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Dean Khoury for the actual session. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Good afternoon. I'm Rudy. Oh, is it working? Rudy Khoury, Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Miami. I'm also the director of the Smart Cities program at the university's Institute for Science and Computing. Direct my research lab called Rhode, which is dedicated to embedded technology, smart cities, etc. So I'm very much invested in technology-driven solutions to climate change impacts. But here today and lately, I am representing the Climate Resilience Academy. I'm the interim director of the Climate Resilience Academy. This is a completely new unit that was created at the university to catalyze, intensify, accelerate climate solutions at the university. And I'm very excited about it, and this is why I'm taking the opportunity to introduce the Academy to you. I'm sure you'll be hearing more about it in the near future. So we are looking at design solutions, and maybe this, because I'm the dean of the School of Architecture, I'm of course biased, but I think this is where the action is. Surely the strategies to climate change impacts would have to go through design or design thinking. That's the arena, I think, that will be critical in this process. And we have today some very exciting, interesting examples that have gained a lot of attention to present to you from an engineer. I call him also an honorary architect and landscape architect, and also somebody who represents the regulatory framework in which these proposals are developed and sharpened. So I'm going to ask actually our panelists to present themselves, tell us a bit about their background, and tell us how they got here to this stage at this moment.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Landolf, and I'm an assistant professor at the College of Engineering. My background is on structures, and I'm here today because we've been working on coastal protection, trying to merge basically engineering with restoration. This is a new arena, something that has never been done properly, I would say. We have some examples, but we're still learning. So there's a lot of things that we should research and that we should join together forces between different sciences and what Rudy says is design thinking. I call it engineering thinking, and I'm wearing my hat of architect now. But this is all together bringing the right people addressing the A to Z from idea to implementation to actually policeman.
Okay. My name is Kate Orff. I'm a landscape architect. I find the phrase totally unuseful to describe actually what it is that I do and what I'm interested in, which is essentially partnering with cities and communities to envision a change process relative to climate and kind of renaturing. So I've been working in the New York Harbor area, in San Francisco Bay, in particular in the Gulf of Mexico, to try to envision these integrated synthetic landscape scale change processes that integrate climate resilience and resilience thinking with nature-based features and the natural world.
I'm Cortney Worral. I'm the president and CEO of the Waterfront Alliance. We are a New York, New Jersey-based nonprofit that's been around now for 16 years. We do work nationally now through a program that I'll talk about. We also were established, though, because of the continued transition of the harbor of New York and New Jersey from its industrial past to what should be a world-class waterfront. I came here because I was a competitive swimmer as a kid. I loved water. I found a niche, but also I was a big environmentalist, and I love the intersection of where humans and environment meet and how to change things in the world. One of the things I specialize in is organizational development, campaigns, and coalitions.
Thank you. So Landolf, not 1 week goes by here in South Florida, and if you're from the region, you know what I mean, without hearing about your work in green infrastructure and also the sophisticated simulators where you test your ideas. So can you share with us?
All right, we can show a little bit. So we have been working at the University of Miami as a coalition of scientists and engineers developing solutions. Actually, although I come from the gray part, which a lot of us call the dark part, I started working on breakwaters, investigating coral reefs, trying to quantify their impact on wave energy so that we can make an argument when we promote this as an alternative to other solutions. Interesting though, next slide please. Interesting though, corals grow with a slow rate. The fast-growing corals grow like 4 inches per year. So to have an impact, if we are to restore, we need time, we need space. And of course, there's a certain uncertainty with respect to living environments. So now the gray part, which some of us like, it gives you an immediate solution. On the opposite, however, it doesn't provide all the ecosystem benefits that green provides. So what if we had both? What if we provided nature the platform to have a solution that dissipates wave energy and gives us basically the fertile ground for corals to grow? So give us time for them to grow. Next slide, please. So if we have to address this, we have to rethink the way design is approached. So far, we've been designing, putting ourselves in the center of everything. And now we have to design for nature. And again, this is, I think, the change in the paradigm. So we have to think about the structure, the form, material, and forces in a different way. So what we did We came up with a solution that basically we got inspired from nature. So we got this hexagonal pattern. We got some perforation, so waves can go in, dissipate energy. We're using concrete, but sustainable concrete, and we try to use it in a wise way. That's why the hexagonal pattern. And we tested this in the hurricane simulator. So what we came up for one of our pilots, and this is in collaboration with the city of Miami Beach, and they've been, thank you, Amy, and her office for putting everything together, but this is what we proposed, and the idea was, let's build a breakwater that's going to become a living breakwater. So we're going to transplant corals, monitor the ecological growth and the engineering performance. I'm happy to report that on last Wednesday, we put those modules there. They're waiting to get acclimated, and then we will transplant the corals. And again, this is an experiment. We'll see how it goes, but we're trying to put the best on our side.
Thank you. We'll come back to this, but yes. We have questions, but now I'd like to hear from Kate, who has risen to international prominence for living also bare infrastructure, but also she has this reputation for being very savvy at engaging with what she calls the dark matter. I'm going to quote her. Dark matter, invisible, regulatory, administrative, permitting, and political systems that determine how, what, and where we build. So could you please tell us more?
I see planners in the audience nodding. So, okay, you can go to the next slide. I'll just talk a little bit about what I'm working on in the New York Harbor. As many of you know, I guess 10 years ago we were hit with Superstorm Sandy. And as a result of that, I worked, with then Mayor Bloomberg to envision a kind of coastal protection plan for the entire city. And then over time, there was a process called Rebuild by Design that essentially helped try to bring a tiny bit of funding forward for innovation and infrastructure. Most of the rest of it was just like rebuilding back what was already there, I'm afraid. So this tiny sliver of a tiny sliver helped seed this project, which is a 1.5 linear mile necklace of breakwaters off the coast of, in Raritan Bay, off the coast of Staten Island. And the idea is, if you can see in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, this is the theory of change, right? So it's not about objects, it's not about biomimicry or placing things or financializing nature. It's really about trying to hit the reset button in terms of coastal communities and then the living infrastructure and ecosystems that protect them. So these structures reduce risk, help rebuild the shoreline, rebuild it in the New York environment, and I could only imagine here in Miami, a complete collapse of marine life. We had in the New York context about 1% of our historic oyster population. And similar to Miami, you have reefs in steep decline, and so the idea was to also rebuild shoreline culture through funding school programs like that you see on the right for place-based restoration. You can go to the next slide. This is just a cross section of the living breakwater that is being built now, and it has, in addition to obviously the risk reduction, kind of immediate presence of risk reduction over time. These are seeded with oysters. We have oyster baskets and nurseries on shore. They grow and change next over time. And so the idea is that there's this sort of replicable concept, right? Because even though we're talking about climate, what we're really talking about is change in people's behaviors and in the bringing people closer to the landscapes that frankly will protect them. And I suppose that's my hidden thesis here, is that the most resilience will come from a robust, living, thick, three-dimensional landscape. And if we invest in our landscapes, we will be better. So I'll just flip through the rest of the slides quickly, because this is an image of some of the oyster culture, past and present, that's happening now, engaging schools and communities along the waterfront. This is my stand-in slide for the dark matter. These are Republican and Democrats standing side by side, and our senator saying, "Living breakwaters." And of course, we got the funding for this modest funding. But I think in between that, computer-generated image that you see and this next image was 8 years of dark matter. Was an environmental impact statement that was like this long, 7 binders. It was permitting federal, state, local, when we had a governor and a mayor that did not talk to each other. I will just say that a big part of my goal in joining this panel is to try to make doing the right thing faster and easier, because this, even though it was a fast track project, was incredibly difficult next. But we've had some great results. We have oysters growing, we have seals hauling out, and I'm excited to have it as a model for many places.
Cortney, let's hear from you now. You build and maintain the framework in which these proposals have to exist. So can you tell us a bit about how these policies shape adaptation at the very fundamental level, but also more specifically about how you have created some of the very effective tools in tackling climate change impacts?
Great. Well, so I like to think that we bring a little bit of light into the dark matter, but it has a long way to go. So the Waterfront Alliance developed about 12 years ago as a concept and formally as a program. 10 years ago, we developed a waterfront edge design guideline standard. And this standard is in structure similar to LEED energy efficiency certification. So if a coastal development chooses to be verified by us, and that acronym is WEDGE, then the project then can receive a verification that it has met standards for climate resilience, for ecology, and for community responsiveness. And so our motivation to do this early on was definitely climate change, but the concept came before Hurricane Sandy, and Hurricane Sandy was just a seminal, it was a turning point for so many people in different ways, even outside of our industry, it was in so many ways. But what we found with the need for design standards for the New York, New Jersey harbor is that this could be applied nationally, and that climate resilience, as it's climate change bearing down, ground zero is our coastlines and waterfronts. Climate change and resilience can be incorporated into this standard in very strong ways. So our standard allows for projects that want to go above and beyond what's regulatorily required, that want to go above and beyond what might be not required for climate resilience and get credit for it, and to be seen as a leader, but also investing in solutions that are going to save a lot of money in the long run, that this verification is the way to go. So it is in fact voluntary. I would love for it to be required everywhere. We would love for that to happen. It is happening in small places, in small ways and larger ways, where certain cities have required the wedge verification to be examined and potentially held to for different projects. The standard works nationally across all coastlines and also freshwater systems. That version of Wedge 3.0 will be released shortly, and so it's a national game changer. It also speeds things up, we hope, in terms of this push for innovation. Is it speeding things up on the regulatory side? That's a different question, and we can talk about that a little bit more.
Great. So when I talk about design, what I have in mind is this virtual platform where multiple agencies come to interplay, collaborate. So I'm thinking about the back and forth, for instance, between, I'm imagining you, Kate, and Cortney, how your design may change the framework, and also collaborations with engineer. So could you give us, all of you, I would like to hear about that, the complexity of this process and the interplay between different disciplines, but also constituencies and agencies.
So I think it's such a complex topic that, I mean, nobody will attack it by its own. So there's no discipline that can take that charge. And the way we actually have to attack it is, as you said, there is this iterative process of learning the language and learning also to navigate that and the design process and how we change our designs when we get informed from the challenges or the principles that drive that design is critical. I think we learn a lot with respect to the policy making. We also challenge the policy making, and we also learn what the stakeholders like or don't like, and we also educate them. So I think that this is all part of that aspect. And we also have to be, like I would say, on top of our game when it comes to the science, to how we promote basically our results and how we transfer that. So there's a lot of things there.
I mean, I feel like we could talk about design for hours, because I do feel like in the past, decades, design has kind of become a symbol of like commodity, right? Oh, I've redesigned this trash can so it's ergonomically shaped or something. But I guess when I think about design and how design is better thought about is that it is truly like a synthetic stance towards the world, where you're absorbing and synthesizing many, many, many varied inputs. And I see design in this case, like the ability to integrate and synthesize these inputs and like push them into a plan of moving forward. That plan may take the form of a building, a breakwater, a regional vision, etc. So that's how I like to think about design. It's that capacity for absorbing research, translating that research into propositional thinking and an action plan. And I feel like that's the kind of design that's missing. It's a scale of design thinking, for lack of a better word, that's missing. It's a kind of a way of pulling things together. I mean, one example is some of our work in the Gulf Coast. Scape has an office in New Orleans, and we've been working with the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which is the authority that got some of the BP penalty money after the Deepwater Horizon spill. So there's been this ongoing kind of master plan, but as we were able to try to synthesize very, very, very many, kind of scientific and technical inputs, try to meld that with how people perceive information and change, and try to develop a kind of an iteration of that master plan that, rather than being seen as 27 disparate things, this is happening here, this might happen here, and try to synthesize it into much more of like a landscape scale transformation that people could understand, that reflected themselves and their place in the world, and kind of pulled it together in terms of like not just a disparate series of actions that are unrelated into something that is legible and that would mean kind of building up to landscape level change and coastal restoration. So that's what I dream about when I think about design, and would wish, and I feel like somehow in America we're all segregated in terms of how we think about things, and it needs that kind of thinking to bring us to a new place.
And our hope is that interdisciplinary thinking and that moving away from particular sectors or specialties is integrated within our design standard, within the wedge verification standard. And I think that what's really interesting is that a lot of landscape architects really love this program, and that's because it's a very interdisciplinary field. And I think that, I think there's plenty of you probably been thinking about the climate solutions are interdisciplinary. And so how do you bring disciplines that are taught in silos in our universities and colleges and bring them into something that can actually change and make the world a better place? And that's what we're hoping to do with the wedge standard. So I think that innovation actually is a tough thing when it comes to climate resilience, and it is for climate. I mean, we're here, all of us today and these next few days, because innovation is really hard. And it's made harder because of how we've siloed specialties for so long, and we've also siloed the regulatory environment. So good design has to address all of those issues that are in the more human process, regulatory, government, decision-making side as well.
Okay, so there's a proliferation actually of design, visions, and solutions. Every day we see something extraordinary, floating cities, etc. But the ones that stick like yours are the ones I think that are very interdisciplinary and that struggle and engage more productively with the real, the, the realities, including the regulatory framework. But surely you have many challenges that you encounter with this work, and I would like to hear from each of you about what you see as the most critical challenge that you have to tackle in the implementation of those visions.
Okay, that's a very tough question, but a very interesting one. So I think that first of all, there is I mean, you can think of it that the obstacles or the challenges that we have in multiple levels, but I think one of the most important ones that comes, I mean, from let's say being a scientist and engineer and being on the academic world is the messaging. Is how we take the messaging from what we see in the lab and how we translate that and how we show that this has value and how it is translated into action on the field. How do you communicate that to stakeholders, to the policymakers? Sometimes it's about getting a data set from the lab and showing these results and making a case, but how you translate what we see as science and how do you make that action and policy is something that is hard, and I argue that we were never taught to do that. So that's an important. So I mean, kudos to the team here because they translate that to the next level. I'm just in the lab.
So you don't have any challenges with the permitting?
We do, but we also have great partners that help us navigate, and we learn from that. So I mean, the permitting and the regulatory framework, we certainly challenge it. And coming from academia, I mean, I go a little bit innocent in that field, and I ask questions, and why this and why that, and I mean, again, like I'm treating it as a playground where I'm discovering things, and that's a little bit a nice way for me to also, let's say, tickle some feathers and create some noise. And I don't know if it's always appreciated, but that's how we move forward.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm trying to answer very honestly because I've sort of described here the kinds of challenges that we face, right? Like the thing to do that's easy and immediate is a vertical bulkhead wall. Okay, just full stop, right? So that's what we've inherited. But that's what's not a wedge, certified design, but it's fast and it's easy and it's moving forward. And what happens when you have sea level rise against a vertical bulkhead wall, right? We've lost intertidal habitat. We've lost the fish nurseries. We've lost seagrass. We've lost reefs. We've lost this kind of rich three-dimensional mosaic of shorelines that actually create life in the marine world, period, right? So it's what's difficult for me is it's quite easy to do the wrong thing. And then it's quite, and I think finding a right path is difficult. But if I'm being very honest, I think what is the most difficult thing for me is trying to proceed, right, with our lives in climate adaptation and thinking about resilience, thinking about actions that we can take, while I feel like the actual natural world that we inhabit is collapsing in the midst of our actions, right? So, I really appreciated your slide around the gray infrastructure because in a way, what I feel like we're doing in the adaptation space is we are building a bridge, right? We are building a bridge so that life on Earth can sustain itself, migratory birds, fish populations, manatees, whatever that means to you personally. All of these species are in a state of decline and crisis. So we are building a bridge to the future where we can hold on, but we also are trying to create the conditions for other species to live. So if I'm being honest, what's difficult for me is that duality or that reality about what is the most important thing to be doing right now, because it's adaptation, but it's also about understanding that it's our responsibility to build a kind of a lifeline so that some future of biodiverse life can be sustained.
And is there a way to predict or be precise about that, the consequences of those your moves.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I'm struggling with is that, you know, I'm sort of working on what you would call a project scale, and that scale is also, it's both greatly necessary but also insufficient, whereas I do feel like the very difficult things to do that would greatly increase our adaptation resilience are truly like behavioral and policy changes, right, at some larger federal level, state level, local level. I mean, I'm just trying to think about Biscayne Bay here, or like, you know, the excess nitrogen that flows into the bay, right? We can do a lot of things. We can plant mangroves, we can do things, but until we profoundly reduce that nitrogen load, it's going to be very, very difficult for other species to persist, right? So I think there needs to be this reciprocity constantly between doing the project and then sort of pulling back and understanding what is the kind of policy structure that actually is supportive of that project in order to be successful. And I do feel like the best projects, like what we were trying to do in New York here, are projects that try to influence policy, you know, in their making, and try to help spark a change process. So I just feel like as much as it's important to adapt and build, you know, so-called build with nature, I also feel like it's really important to have the incredibly difficult conversations about what we need to stop doing at the same time.
I just want to build on the bridge concept to nature and wildlife in the living world for all things adaptation. You know, New York Harbor is an example of how that works. There was a slide of a seal, and how many of you knew there are seals in New York Harbor that could survive there, and they're not there because they're about to perish for some reason, or they're nearing the end of their life and they need a place to lie down. And we have whales, actually, that are returning to New York Harbor, and also dolphins now in the Bronx River, of all things, and they're following alewives because of the restoration. And so it just proves that if you build it, they will come. And the bridge concept, in terms of everything we have to do for resilience for a living planet in the future, and it will be a living planet for sure, in one way or another, must be integrated into all of our work. In terms of the challenges, a few things. So we are working always to make sure the wedge program is known and that our work and the standard is out there in the world. But I want to just say that one of the major challenges that we face, and I think that Florida has faced as well, is that the idea of building a wall is strong and alive and potentially very fundable. And the Army Corps of Engineers just proposed for the New York Harbor a series of walls that would go around the edge of New York and fundamentally change the characteristics of what makes New York, New York. And those types of projects are easily fundable. They can be permitted if we're not careful. And so we have a huge challenge. And that challenge, I guess, points to the last thing I'm going to mention, which is that philanthropy really has to support the soft side of this work, or the dark matter solutions. It has to support the nonprofits that are on the ground working on this. We have to support philanthropy, and others really need to support neutral parties like nonprofits who can work through the regulatory changes and be there as a voice, a convener for these major regulatory and government policy issues that we have to get over. And also there's just a major role to play in community activity and participation and public participation processes. I was at the panel on siting for the electrical grid, and those topics brought, if anybody was there, that's exactly what we're dealing with when it comes to coastal infrastructure. And so we need actual disciplines and academia to study these as deeply and strongly as they study science and design and engineering. It's incredibly important, and that's the human side, and that's the softer side, considered soft, but it actually is the hardest side in many ways.
So Courtney, that wall you described around New York, that won't work in Miami, for instance, because it has a very different geological condition. So the adaptation solution tend to be always very site-specific, informed by the conditions, geological, environmental, ecological, etc. So, like you all to comment about how your projects, how they are responding to particular conditions, but how do they hold the potential for actually being applied elsewhere? And that would be interesting, Courtney, to hear about wedge. It is by definition meant to be applicable elsewhere, but I would like you to also to comment about its relevance, demonstrated relevance beyond New York.
Yes. Well, so the standard is quite broad. So just to be clear about what it covers. So I'm going to read my cheat sheet. So, and by the way, Joseph Sikawi, who runs the wedge program, is here in the audience. So if you have any really specific technical questions, he's great to help with that. So first of all, the verification standard is very broad in the sense that we are not mandating specific design. We're mandating benefits that come from a few categories. Where is your site going to be located? And how is the planning team put together that is going to be designing this project? Is it interdisciplinary? Do you have the right people on the team? Is the site going to be located, or is your project going to be located in a place that is responsible, given what the challenges are from sea level rise, but also major storms? Do you have a commitment, and have you engaged in community access and community responsiveness in all parts of this project? What is the actual nature of the edge resilience strategies that you have? They could take any form. In some cases, a wall might be the only solution. In some cases, a living breakwater may not be the right solution. There's tons of flexibility for all kinds of solutions, but they must be at some level nature-based or promote natural resources. So that's the next standard. And then lastly, we are looking for innovation. So where you can integrate climate mitigation into your resilience project as well. So I would say it's much less prescriptive, and that's why it works at a national level. It works for any project in the United States, and also for any project that is located in freshwater systems.
Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you for that. So, Kate, can we bring your living breakwater to Miami? Did you ever talk to Amy about it?
Not yet. No, I guess I would just say I think the replicable aspect is not the physical breakwater. It's that world that I showed in the top left corner. It's bringing together people, education, teachers at the shoreline with a unit of adaptive, resilient infrastructure and the rebuilding of ecosystems. So I would just say it's that structure that is the replicable piece. It's not the physical thing. I mean, as part of that topic, I did a big research project on the entirety of the New York, New Jersey harbor, looking at dredge wetlands, looking at dunes, looking at maritime forest strengthening, and so on. So I think that there's many, many forms of thinking about ecosystems as infrastructure that apply in many, many different geographical regions. And so that would be what I would encourage. And so it's really thinking more about what is a combined socio-ecological unit of change? Like what is that tying together of what is considered a community with what is considered a kind of a protective and valued ecological context that I would very much advocate to be replicated. And in the meantime, when we're working on that community and neighborhood scale, I'm really hoping that the Army Corps of Engineers and the other kind of people who are essentially developing the context in which we're all working can evolve and can change.
So Landolf, you're the expert here on what the particular conditions in Miami, for instance, that make this a very challenging proposition. So can you tell us a bit about that, but also how your designs could be applied elsewhere?
I want to build up on what Kate said, ecosystems as infrastructure. And I'm not an expert. I mean, I've not done all the mistakes yet to be an expert. But the critical thing that when you talk with ecologists and marine biologists, they tell you that you need to study the ecosystem itself. So I actually, when we first started our project, I asked them, what are the design guidelines that you have if we want to build a reef, a coral reef here in Miami? And they told me, we don't know. We have to test on the local conditions with the local water, the local turbidity, the shade, the angle of the sun, and so on. And I was going nuts. Why? Because I'm used to having design guidelines and develop based on that. So this is something that we also need to acknowledge. The process is what stays there, and the principles are basically what guides us. But the design itself, the physical object that we will create, might change. And we argue that we don't have the solution or the answer to everything, but we know the right way to develop those solutions. And yes, there are challenges that are different between New York and Miami, but I argue that if we sit down and you build, and you bring everybody to the table and we discuss and we address also the regulatory challenges there, we're going to develop solutions that make sense. And I think that's the key.
I was just going to add, I think that there's something to be said too about Miami. You know, we think about, I mean, it sort of depends on your perspective, right? It's like the southernmost part of the, not most, but this kind of part of the United States that has like a finger in the Caribbean. But in the Caribbean, like all eyes are on you, right? Like whether or not it's acknowledged, like everybody's watching what's happening in Miami. And so I think, you know, I just feel like there's a great weight to that. I've been in with my work at Columbia University, working in Belize and working in Colombia and Cartagena and so on. And the rate of change around the entire Caribbean is just astonishing, like what's happening. And some of that is driven by, frankly, Americanized patterns of extractive tourism. And you know, the erasure of mangroves and the placement and the laying out of private parcels of land, and so it's quite striking. But so I do feel like there are other parts that need to enter into the discussion that go beyond what we're talking about on the stage relative to infrastructure and coastal protection. Like there are key parts to valuing existing intact landscapes. There are key parts to changing our relationship, with somehow this extractive relationship with nature in some cases, and then key parts relative to just thinking about water not just as something that we all look at it that kind of creates a pleasing scenery, but that has like rich life underneath its surface. And that we have to think about how we're using, nitrogen, how our green lawns, how our deforestation, how all of these things are actually creating this environment of extreme risk at the scale of the Caribbean, and that some of our actions, and what's being looked at in terms of Miami, like this type of project, are just incredibly important. But we do need to be also try to lead by example and lead by our actions in other ways, so that the water itself is seen as and the marine organisms and mammals that live in it also have a chance.
But also we tend to, in panels like this, we're always focused on the threats, the challenges. There are also opportunities given the huge investment in infrastructure. Kate, for instance, you always manage to smuggle public amenities in your infrastructural projects. So can you talk about those byproducts, which are, I find actually, I think of as opportunity very optimistically?
Well, there's always this idea of the next unicorn being in climate tech. So this is something that we have to be cognizant. Like there are technological advancements that could lead to, let's say, monetization. But I think the best byproduct is ourselves. Actually, the fact that we transform ourselves through this process, we become better designers, and I argue that that translates into the classroom for us. So this is a very important part.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so one of the differences between Miami and New York and other places is that you can see in the water pretty easily here. You can't in the Northeast. Most of the water is pretty cloudy, and that's natural in the way it works. But so designing projects so that there's nature embedded, it's ecologically sound, it's restorative, it provides the bridge, is a huge opportunity for being able to see what and experience what lives underneath the water. That works in New York also. And it works in lots of different places. So that's something maybe that people who really love to scuba dive or swim take for granted in this region, but it's alive and well everywhere. And why that's important is that we really have to make sure that we're still connected to nature in this potentially great collapse of what's happening with the earth. And the reason for that is that we still are of the earth. We are by nature biophilic. We love nature. All of us do. And if people don't, it's because they haven't been exposed to it in the ways that are necessary. So when Kate is taking school groups to the water in New York, that's revolutionary. And that's something that we have to make sure for every single project where we're working on resilience, that there's that connection to nature, that people can understand and love the earth as part of all of these solutions move forward. And that's the way we build the next generation of advocates. That's the way that we will make sure that climate doomism and the feelings that that we have from losing what we know to be good and right and true and beautiful about the earth are still opportunities. There are still opportunities for us to connect.
So we're going to turn to questions from the audience, but before we do this, the dean and educator in me wants a didactic clarity. So I'm going to ask each of you to just frame one takeaway message for us here. So let's start with you.
Okay, I have to say that gray is not bad, but green-gray is better.
That's a A+. Yeah. All right. I guess I would say love the landscape and think about not just solving problem by problem, but imagining a resilient future in which robust, healthy people and a robust, interconnected landscape working together is your ticket.
Mine is fund the messy human policy government side of all of this work at equal levels.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Oh, we have many questions. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I may be what do you call it, the dark matter? I'm actually an elected official in Hallandale Beach. I don't know if there's any other elected officials here from South Florida, so, okay, now I'm really outnumbered. Okay. But thank you. And my question is directed, and obviously I'm very anxious about hearing the outcomes of, it's Randolph, right? Randolph's projects, because a city like ours, we're spending millions of dollars in renourishment to take care of and redevelop our beaches. You know, we have the kids out there. We're planting, seagrass. But for years, and I'm a northern transplant, guilty as charged, went to Long Beach Island beaches, and grew up with T-groins and, armaments. And here it's like, build absolutely nothing near the beach. So I'm intrigued, especially in Broward, because we're going through third beach renourishment, and we keep begging for a project just like this or something to help break the water. And we, particularly up north in Broward, have hot spots. So to me, ideally, this would be perfect. So I'm really intrigued, and I'm sure I'll coordinate with either one of you later. But where do you see the next steps as an elected official? And I'll make one challenge to you, to have the Mayor Gelbers, myself, Mayor Josh Levy, some of our eastern coast, because we've been kind of hijacked by the whole South Florida Compact, but that's a niche. That's not just great infrastructure, saving the Everglades or treating water. So I'll sit down and be brief, I'm sorry, but I'm just curious your next steps and what we can do to help get behind it. Thank you. Sorry.
So I think the idea is that we use that as a pilot. We use that to gather basically ecological and engineering data. So the next step will be to upscale. And I think the important and the challenge that we're going to face is how do you upscale? And this is, we're talking about ecosystem as infrastructure, but upscaling is an infrastructure problem. And that brings a lot of other challenges from the manufacturing. So we have some representatives here, colleagues from One Print. How do we actually 3D print concrete modules so we can prepare fast and create basically the number of units we need? How do you actually create those units with what type of cement? All these questions that are the technical ones, but more importantly, how do you implement through basically the integration in the policy making? So, I mean, I argue that you have a platform here, and we'll love to work with you, with all of you. And again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that this is the solution. It is a tool that we should have in our toolkit, and we should work together, develop more of these tools.
Yeah, I would just add, I use the term dark matter just because it sits behind you and it essentially defines your path of action. So we're all toiling within a regulatory context. But, I think many of these challenges, or rules, regulations evolved 100 years ago, 50 years ago, right? For example, the Clean Water Act as a prohibition of fill in waters. And for a very good reason, because we were filling our wetlands with garbage, right? So that's gross simplification, but that essentially was what was happening. So, but now we have very, very different challenges, right? So we need to be able to work creatively to rebuild ecosystems and shorelines, and that may involve placing, fill in the case of ecological concrete, et cetera, in our water bodies. So I would say there's just got to be a creative way to do more of an exchange, i.e., and you can undertake these projects if you agree to do X, Y, and Z. Reduce your nitrogen load. Do this, do this, do this. So there has to be some more flexibility in this policy making to enable communities to change. Because I will say one fascinating thing is that I'm on the receiving end of many phone calls of like, we are in this, from Long Island. We are from this community here. I am in this Texas community. There's like a huge wellspring of officials and leaders who are truly trying to change and to adapt. And unfortunately, there's such a level of complexity and such a level of that it actually hinders this process. So all of a sudden, just the engineering fees alone to test, I spent $1.2 million on like a digital model just to prove that my project didn't do it. But communities don't have that money, right? That's what you would have to build your project. So we do have to figure out how to fast track doing the right thing. Like it shouldn't take, and I see this in our work in New Orleans, like what it takes to do a strong, what I would call an ecological restoration project, takes the same amount of time to perceive and permit than a polluting factory, right? Those two things, they should not be on the same track. So there's a lot of things that we can do at a policy and regulatory level, and that's the kind of what I would call the hard stuff, right? The hard thing to do.
Yes.
Hello, Patricia Woodson here, former elected official from the little barrier island of Key Biscayne, where we recognize that we are a porous sponge floating in a bathtub, and yes, a little worried. And other than trying to pump the water off the land back into the surrounding water, which is sort of what's being currently considered, we're just really looking for solutions and partners and models for something really sustainable to enable the island life to continue. So thank you. Oh, also on the board of Outward Bound with an Everglades base camp, doing environmental education, having students and teachers constantly paddling through the Everglades and learning about the whole system. That little island is very challenged, similar problems. So good to be with all of you.
Hi, thank you all for speaking today. I'm with the New York City Housing Authority and part of our resiliency team. And one thing I'm kind of curious about with your various projects is ownership of a lot of these assets that you're kind of creating. Obviously, you have these ideas and you're creating these concepts. And with the pilot that you've shared, it seems to be a great model. But I'm kind of curious about who owns that project for the Housing Authority. If we have some ideas or solutions that work for us, we don't own our water rights or the immediate shores close to our developments. So, what is a kind of proper way to, one, make these interagency collaborations and really navigate this ownership question of either sourcing funding or creating design competitions, which Nige has kind of done before. But again, of who should be managing these assets, because for some of our projects, the city agencies don't want to have their hands on what we're actually doing, even if it benefits them. So. It's kind of worrying. Curious about that.
In our project, basically, the project owner is the city of Miami Beach, and we're lucky to work with the communities and have communities that support us in these initiatives, and it goes back and forth between them. But I mean, I argue that it is also, in some cases, when you see resistance, you need to understand why this exists, and maybe there is some legitimate reasons, or there might be a misunderstanding of what type of, let's say, consequences an implementation that this could have. So there is an educational part also in that side. You have to engage in the conversation. And I argue that you have some other examples here where, I mean, these are larger projects. We are a small project, it's a pilot, and we have some other pilots in the making. But, I mean, we're lucky to have here in South Florida communities that are after basically solutions.
Yeah. So my answer to you is call us and let's talk about it. And then that really is, in terms of the broader answer to this question, is that there is a very strong role for community organizations that have access to government decision makers to help open doors, but also to think about, if you're getting closed doors over and over and over again, the advocacy strategy or the public push and how that can work. And that's another really important reason for the nonprofits and the community organizations that are working in this space to have the resources to be able to do that, to help advocate for what is needed for interagency collaboration that would eventually lead to ownership, which should be, when we can talk about it, but New York City needs to own it at some level. And so it's a matter really of which agency is going to take it on. And they haven't planned for this, so they don't really have a staffer who can do it. And so there are ways to solve that. Part of it also is funding government and government agencies that work on these projects at staffing levels, given the challenges we're facing. But also you can create that demand and make it impossible, at least in New York and New Jersey context, impossible to say no.
Hi, Ian Wogan. I would consider myself a green infrastructure practitioner, mainly working with trees, a lot of mangroves. Really interesting topic of conversation coming off of our Back Bay study, which happened with U.S. Army Corps and Miami-Dade County last week. And that's probably a 10-year process in the making. In the meantime, I feel like we have a very interesting development dynamic here in South Florida, which is, it almost feels like kind of a pump and dump scheme is get in, build it as fast as you can, sell it off and get out. And I see that as really destructive, considering how much land is under private ownership. And so I'm wondering if you guys have any tools or know of any policy or any implementation that's happened to really place value on ecosystem services, ecological function, and how that contributes and how it may be regulated so there's actually incentive to develop in ways that make sense long term.
The million-dollar question. Yes. I mean, this also goes back to the question of owner, too. Like, So one of the challenges in our watery environment is that private property goes to the water's edge. Except anyone from California in here? The California Coastal Act, right? There's some really notable exceptions, like with the California Coastal Act. So I also just feel like right now we don't have the right tools, because there's a series of, and if you look on the coast of New Jersey, there's like a dune, and then there's like a break at somebody's house. They don't want the dune, So it's like coast comprehensive kind of thinking, which is what is needed for a coastal environment, is not present in our current property ownership system, right? It's like each property for themselves, and that kind of just falls down at a certain moment. So I've been inspired by the California Coastal Act, and like the sense that 50 feet from shoreline is essentially some form of public realm and some form of shared civic world, civic life. There's precedent for that, and I agree with you that there's this like first do no harm concept of that needs to be somehow fully integrated into our environmental policy, which is like keep intact landscapes intact. And then, and then we need to, frankly, I'm sure it's a dirty word, but densify. We need to densify where we've already built, right? And we need to kind of create more contiguous, fabric and mosaic of natural systems where they already exist. So right now I feel like America's super hamstrung by, we don't have the land policy tools or somehow to actually kind of make some of these changes that you're talking about. And I wish you the best of your luck.
Well, and my answer is get in touch with us and let's require wedge verification, or make it hard to have a project that is not wedge verified in Florida or in Miami. And it's a great way to incentivize these changes without going through the regulatory and legal changes that might be needed.
Okay, the time is up unless you have...
No, I just wanted to make a quick comment on this. There are some new, let's say, frameworks in terms of tax and insurance that actually feed back to nature-based solutions. So there is progress and there is hope. So let's stay on that.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our speakers, and thank you all for joining us for this panel.